Point, I think Michael and yeah, welcome everyone. I think at this point, Michael doesn't need too much of an introduction. He has, I think, doing this now for the fifth or sixth time, Michael?
Fifth, I think.
Fifth, okay. Michael, as you may know, is the Paul Choueiri Family Professor of Global Business. He's going to be formally inaugurated in that role in a few days, so we're delighted that's going to be happening very soon. He's going to talk to us today about the impact of foreign companies on the Chinese economy. And let me just remind you that my colleague George Ip, who's also on this call, will be speaking on December 1st about innovation strategies for foreign companies in China. Over to you, Michael.
Thank you, Ravi. Let me just share my screen appropriately. And I think we're ready to go. Okay, once again, I'm very thankful to Ravi and the Center for Emerging Markets at the DeMoore McKim School here at Northeastern for hosting this series. Again, it's been, I think, quite interesting for me, certainly, and hopefully for many of you as well. What I'm going to talk about tonight is, as was indicated, the impact of foreign companies on China's economy. Now, this is work that I started a number of years ago and recently have updated. And I'll show you the sort of the base results and then leave time at the end for Q&A for capturing some of the more recent events, what's going on with respect to foreign companies in China, because as you know, things move so quickly, it's impossible to sort of get it all down at any one time. That's me, Pierre Choueiri, Family Professor, International Business. I've been at Northeastern now for just over a year. Before that, I was based in Hong Kong and Singapore for 24 years, and I've been doing China strategy work for governments, major international firms, et cetera, for many years. Selected publications. I'm actually going to focus on work that's on the right side here, but I'll pick that up in a few minutes. Okay, the background on the research of impact of multinational companies on host economies. I mean, it's a very old topic, but a number of years ago, around 2015, we felt it was time to take another look. Global markets were difficult. We saw inequities around the world, populism rising, tough competition, environmental pressures, resource constraints, all putting additional pressure on home governments, on host governments, the governments that host foreign companies. And there was increasing pressure on foreign investment, on multinationals, and on globalization in general. It's not just the last couple of years that those pressures have been rising. They've really been rising more or less from the middle of the 2010s or 2010s. And so we felt that it was time to revisit the value generated by multinationals or foreign direct investment for host countries, and then how it's communicated. Because it turns out that relatively few host governments do a sophisticated analysis of the costs and benefits associated with inward foreign investment. And multinational companies rarely do actually complete assessment of the value that they generate for host economies. I'll give an example of that later. Foreign chambers of commerce, business groups, governments, they really don't know the value that their companies generate in host countries. And in the absence of information and knowledge, basically what winds up happening is the policy debates are often sterile, driven by sound bites. Many host economies don't obtain the full benefits of foreign investment, and many multinationals and source countries don't have the information to basically make the case for why it is they or their companies should be allowed access to global markets. And it turns out it is possible to take a much more sophisticated approach than is generally the case. Usually what we see is that companies or countries compile the foreign direct investment flow data. So you'll be able to, from UNCTAD, be able to get data on the foreign investment flows between countries. But the foreign investment flows themselves, that's not the economic impact on the ground, right? That's like the capital investment. It's not the operations, it's not the wages, it's not the profits, it's not the cost of goods sold that's generated by these companies in their host environments. So as I say, there's got to be a better way, and we believe that there is a better way. Our initial projects on this were carried out 2015 to 2017, sponsored by the Heinrich Foundation, a Hong Kong and Singapore-based foundation. We took 18 months to do the original study. We used China as the test case, as the largest and most important developing economy. One where foreign multinationals have done well. I see some of our participants on the session tonight actually have worked for multinationals that have done pretty well in China, and one where foreign investment has been a huge contributor to the local economy. And China actually may be a trendsetter in multinational company developing country relations. Increasingly, China is viewed as a model or a touchstone for countries trying to develop their economies, and also in attracting and dealing with foreign investment. And we undertook several project phases. We basically ran the table. We were able to do basically all the pieces of research that we thought were necessary, thanks to our sponsors. We reviewed the complete evolution of Chinese policy towards foreign investment, from the initial documents first postulating China's economic opening in the mid to late 70s, running through basically to today. We reviewed all the academic and think tank literature, both in Chinese and outside, well, in Chinese and in English, from both inside and outside of China. We pulled together all the facts, the figures, and looked in detail at the activities that were being performed by major multinationals through a series of case studies. We undertook a series of economic impact analyses that I'll describe a bit later. We did our case studies of impacts of specific companies, but also the impact of foreign investment on particular locations. If you go to Shenzhen today, roughly 2/3 of Shenzhen's GDP is attributable either directly or one step removed up the supply chain from foreign invested enterprises. In Shanghai, 14 years ago, 83% of the high-tech output in Shanghai was by foreign invested enterprises. Last year, that was 90%, 90. So basically, without the foreign invested enterprises, a city as important as Shanghai virtually has no high-tech sector. Other cities are different, but that's the situation in Shanghai. Then for the academic economists in the crowd, we did a series of econometric analyses across a wide range of variables. I'll just mention those. I'm not going to go into detail on that tonight, given that this is talk for a more general audience. Then we also did a follow-on project that looked specifically at the impact of US companies on China's economy, and I'll describe some of the results there as well. Some of the publications that have come out of this, 2017 English language book and the Chinese language book. When we presented our results to MOFCOM, Ministry of Commerce in China, they actually volunteered to have their think tank, the Chinese Academy of International Trade and Economic Cooperation, do the translation for us into Chinese. That's the central publication here. And then, in fact, they helped us take our analysis and vet our methods and results with all the major central government agencies in China, from Development and Reform Commission to the Development Research Council of State Council to Ministry of Finance to basically the entire set of relevant economic and financial agencies. Then the publication on the right is the study of the impact on the US economy. The first two are available from your favorite bookseller, Amazon, or from the relevant publishers. And the one on the right is actually available on the internet directly from the Heinrich Foundation, which has links to other follow-on publications from the work. One of the striking things when we took apart the history of Chinese policy towards foreign investment and its effect, how that affected foreign invested enterprises, FIEs for the uninitiated, foreign invested enterprises, FDI, foreign direct investment, where foreign direct investment globally is usually defined as investment that takes at least a 10% equity share and also has a significant level of management control. In China, it's at least 25% foreign investment and de facto heavy foreign either control or decision-making on the organization. And China's policies towards foreign investment have been influenced by its unique history. It is not an exaggeration to say that in the 1800s that foreign investment was imposed on China at the point of a gun. And any foreigner looking at foreign investment in China has to remember that. There is an almost inherent suspicion of foreign investment in China because of that history and the century of difficulty for China that emerged out of that period. And so for China and China's leaders, foreign investment and allowing foreign invested enterprises in China has reflected a constant tension between trying to gain the benefits of the foreign investment while retaining control over the economy, developing indigenous companies, and limiting the influence of foreign multinationals. A lot of the literature on multinational company activities, particularly in the developing world, focus on how large, powerful multinationals from the developed world often are difficult for governments in developing countries to understand, manage, and deal with because they're just so big, they're just so powerful. Now, there's a flip side, though, because for the multinationals, investing in China has reflected the constant tension between the potential benefits from that investment and the risks of investing in China. And another thing that we have to remember is that when China started to open to foreign investment in the late 1970s, early 1980s, there was actually no legal or administrative system in place to oversee private indigenous companies, no less foreign companies. There more or less was no private sector. And a lot of the laws, rules, regulations, and administrative procedures that are necessary in any country where the government doesn't run the whole economy, virtually none of those were present in China. So part of the process of allowing foreign investment into China was the process of setting up and the need to set up a system to deal with non-state actors in the economy. And then, in fact, in many ways, rules, regulations, and laws that eventually came to govern the Chinese private sector, many of them actually came out initially of the rules, regulations, and laws to govern the foreign invested sector. So the result has been a step-by-step process for both China and for companies. And this has been by geography, first 4 special economic zones, 14 coastal cities, the entire set of coastal provinces, the interior, et cetera, to the point where China is fully open. There are no geographic areas that are off limits or restricted much more so than others in terms of foreign investment. By ownership structure, first forced joint ventures of various types, wholly foreign-owned enterprises, foreign-owned holding companies, et cetera, and sector. And there, China still is a work in process. There still is a catalog of sectors where foreign investment is either restricted or prohibited. Restricted means allowed under certain conditions, usually with either a Chinese partner with a controlling interest or a 50-50 joint venture, and prohibited some sensitive sectors where foreign investment simply is not allowed. And it's quite a long list still even today. And as I say here, Chinese officials and foreign enterprise managers basically have gone through a process of mutual discovery. Discovering, and gradually de-risking the process of foreign investment on both sides, which leads a question about the future, which I'll sort of leave to the end. There's a vast literature on multinational and foreign direct impact on China. There's a huge literature in English, and there's a much, much larger literature in Chinese. And most foreign researchers, most foreign companies, most foreign governments are completely ignorant of that literature, which is unfortunate because more so than in many countries, the academic literature, be it economists and analysts, is actually more influential in China than it is in many other countries. And so there's this vast literature which is influencing the policy regime in China. And again, many outsiders simply are not aware of the existence of that literature, no less what it actually says. Now, strikingly, most of the English literature on foreign investment in multinationals in China focuses on the impact that foreign investment in multinationals have had on China's GDP, its economic growth, productivity, or consumer welfare. On the other hand, the vast majority of Chinese literature focuses on the impact that foreign investment and multinationals have had on Chinese companies and their competitiveness. And this is not surprising if one reviews the history of policy towards foreign investment in China, because to a first approximation, foreign investment was not allowed into China primarily to boost the GDP numbers or standard of living. It was introduced to boost the effectiveness, efficiency, and competitiveness of Chinese companies. And that goes right back to the original documents when economic opening was first even mooted. And the difference in the literature reflects the difference in the comparative concerns and the objective functions with which foreign investment is viewed in different economies. In the West, people look at foreign investment. Is it creating jobs? Is it creating economic activity? In China, the ethos is we look at foreign investment in terms of, is it helping our companies become more effective, more efficient, more effective competitors, so China and China Inc. can become stronger. Okay? So it's a very different dynamic, and it's reflected in the literature. The econometric work on the impact of foreign investment on China, again, a lot of variables have been looked at: GDP growth, per capita productivity, whether foreign investment crowds out domestic investment, whether if you get more foreign investment, it reduces domestic investment, or whether it crowds in, whether it creates a dynamic that creates economic dynamism that brings in more domestic investment. That's an issue that's been looked at. whether foreign investment has facilitated technological development within Chinese companies, whether it's enhanced employment and wages, both in general and within Chinese companies, et cetera. And again, sorry to gloss over this, but anyone interested in this should take a look at our book. And there's also a very detailed document on the Heinrich Foundation website of our redoing of most of the econometric work with extended data sets, better variables, improved methods, et cetera. Okay, some of the numbers. Despite the fact that we've been hearing about decoupling and about China trying to sort of become more independent, actually the foreign investment flows into China have been going up. Last year, while the rest of the world was down in terms of foreign investment by about 20%, China was actually up to about 145 billion US dollars inward investment, leaving the cumulative foreign investment in China since China started to open at about 2.4 trillion US dollars. And I put both numbers on here advisedly, because while 140 billion US dollars sounds like a lot of money, I mean, I could certainly retire on it. When we look at China's overall economy, and it's now what, about a 11, 12 trillion US dollar GDP economy, 140 billion is not as large, you know, in comparative terms as we might initially think, just looking at that number. Sorry, trying to get, there we go. In terms of sources of foreign investment, this is just the latest year available. Still, the bulk of it is rooted through Hong Kong one way or another. A significant chunk of that is Hong Kong and is actually money that's raised in the Hong Kong stock market. So if you raise money in the Hong Kong stock market and deploy it in the Chinese mainland, it appears that that counts as foreign investment. Particularly if you have a Hong Kong-based subsidiary that's doing that. In addition, Hong Kong has been noted as a source for routing capital from the Chinese mainland outward and then back in. But look at, you know, US, this is less than 3 billion US dollars. So it's not a huge amount. Cayman Islands, Virgin Islands, those are just tax havens that companies use. And the Netherlands, actually a lot of US outbound investment is rooted through holding companies in either Luxembourg or the Netherlands. But again, just a relative sourcing. Now, one of the things that's striking is that when you talk to some analysts in China about foreign investment, they say, well, wait a minute. If we look at foreign direct investment as a share of gross capital formation, a proxy for total investment in the Chinese economy, what you see is that it's about 2.5%. Excuse me. In other words, not a huge share. And in fact, China last year was a net exporter of capital. Its outbound foreign direct investment was larger than its inbound foreign direct investment. So to a first approximation, China doesn't need the money in terms of capital, whereas there was a time in the 90s where, you know, it might have. And there was a time when this was, you know, 10, 12, 14%. And similarly, if we look at the trade performance of foreign invested enterprises, the net exports, that's the GDP contribution to trade, is exports minus imports. So if we take the exports minus imports of foreign invested enterprises in China, that's now under 1%. So again, China's inward investors, them exporting out of China as an export engine, well, that's mostly matched by their imports. In many cases, imports that go into the exports that are then sent out. But in either case, it doesn't look too good for the importance of foreign investment in either of these charts. However, when you start breaking down the economy, you find that foreign invested enterprises themselves still account for well over 20% of industrial value added. And since industrial value added is over 40% of GDP, you already have a significant chunk of GDP, about 10% or more, which is just the GDP generated inside the foreign invested enterprises in the industrial sector. That's ignoring the service sector. And service sector inward investment has been substantially larger than manufacturing over the last several years. And many advanced industries are dominated by foreign companies. They're looked to as technology leaders, etc. But there are better tools that we can use to look at the economic impact. In particular, there's an area of economics called economic impact analysis, where you can take, usually it's used for single investments. If you're going to build a convention center or a bridge or an airport, often there'll be an economic impact analysis where you look not just at the investment itself and not just the company set up by the investment, that's the direct impact, but you also look at the indirect impact, the impact on the supply chains, because a company operating will have a ripple effect all the way back through their suppliers, their suppliers, suppliers, their suppliers, 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 etc. And then in addition, the employees of the investing company and all the supply chain companies, they are consumers, and their consumer spending is called the induced impact. Sometimes additional impacts are added in called catalytic, and you get something called total economic impact. This is quite commonly done for individual investments. What we did, or ESA, my Enright, Scott and Associates, my firm, we figured out how to take that methodology and apply it for inward investment across an entire economy, unpacking when a foreign enterprise sources from a foreign enterprise, which sources from a foreign enterprise, because you have to eliminate the double and triple counting. It all depends on the input-output tables, which come from official sources in China, which just show the relationships between different industries in the economy. And again, there are well-known steps that are used for individual investments, and our use of these tools across the entire economy, we vetted that with economists from MOFCOM, Chinese Academy of International Trade, Economic Cooperation, NDRC, DRC, Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, the Party School, Ministry of Finance, universities, everybody. They've all approved of the methodology. And what did we find? Well, what we found is that if we look at the initial investments, and then the foreign invested enterprise impacts in the secondary, the industrial sector, the direct, indirect, plus induced, we got this yellow area. And if we added in the service sector, we got the blue area. And basically, this is about a third of China's GDP. And this has been relatively stable for nearly a decade. So what that means is that even in terms of the absolute value of the capital brought into China by foreign invested enterprises today, even though that's small, that the operations on the ground, based on that cumulative $2.4 trillion of foreign investment, plus the impact on the supply chains, plus the impact on consumer spending, all of that together accounts for about a third of China's GDP. And about 25% of China's employment. So this is quite substantial. And we did not even try to quantify when foreign invested enterprises source in China and then sell outside of China, or selling the foreign invested enterprise goods on downstream distribution, or on the role that foreign companies have played in modernizing industries and companies in China, or in many cases, foreign enterprises have helped develop their suppliers and distributors in China, creating economic entities and economic efficiency that wasn't there before. It also doesn't include any spillovers and spin-offs from the R&D, tech development, and local linkages that foreign firms have had that spills into local firms. Doesn't include any attribution of improving business practices and standards. basically foreign accounting firms worked with the Chinese government to bring modern accounting standards to local firms in China. The improvements in local firms as a result of that are not captured in our quantitative estimates, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So all of the things on this page, which may be as important as the things we can quantify, none of them are quantified in that third of China's GDP being generated by the foreign invested enterprises, supply chains, and consumer spending resulting thereof. We can do case studies of individual companies. And when we looked at a company like Procter & Gamble, the year that we had good information from them was 2014. Sorry, it's getting a little dated. According to their official corporate reports, they had invested $2.5 billion in China. They had 5.5 billion US dollars in sales in China. And through AC Nielsen and other statistics, point of sales statistics, we were able to estimate that there was 4.5 billion in retailer and distributor markups. And these were the numbers that Procter & Gamble used to say, hey, we're contributing to China. We've invested 2.5 billion. You know, we're contributing here. We employ about 10, 12,000 people. And that was their, you know, that was their public statement. Well, what we were able to do is go through and understand what their sales were generating in terms of supply chains, what the employees of the supply chains, the distribution channels were spending as consumers. And when we looked at all the ripple effects, basically in any given year, the GDP contribution, the value add contribution out of this was about 11 billion US dollars, and the entire system that they were driving was supporting 612,000 employees. So when you go to your local government to ask about, you know, this rule, that regulation, get approval for your projects, do you want to say that you directly employ 10, 12,000, or do you want to say, well, if you look at the entire system, the supply chain, the distribution network, all of the consumer spending that results, we actually support 600,000 workers. You know, it's not a hard argument to make. It's not a hard argument to understand which one you go after. And this doesn't include, again, all sorts of non-quantifiable spillovers that P&G has had in China. So this suggests a much larger impact that's usually imagined. Well, let's take a look at US companies. And here we have another interesting story. First, look at the sales line. In terms of sales, US foreign affiliates, so the affiliates of US companies in China account for about 6% of the total foreign affiliate sales of US companies, but only about 2% of the profits. So in other words, the Chinese entities are only about a third as profitable on a return on sales basis as the US companies' average overseas activities. And yet, the US foreign affiliates in China, on average, they employ twice as many people proportionately as sales. So China has more employees and less profits for US companies on average, you know, again, compared to sales, which is pretty interesting. If we look at the US companies alone and do the same percentage analysis, we find that about 4% of China's GDP and about 2.6, 2.7% of China's employment generated by US firms, their supply chains, and then the ripple effects through the economy. And if we look at what people usually look at, which is just the investment flow data, and if we look at the investment flow data compared to the economic impact, the GDP impact of that entire system, what we find in recent years, the annual positive GDP impact on China's economy of US companies operating in China has been roughly $200 times the annual investment flow. And for those that are interested, for every dollar of profit a US company makes in China, it actually is helping to generate over $20 of GDP benefit in China. So this notion of the foreign company, making money off of, the Chinese people, it's hard to support. US companies are making money in China, some of them making quite a lot of money, but on average, basically it's the Chinese economy that's making out from US foreign investment, as it does quite well on foreign investment from other countries as well. So US firms do make profits, and they actually sell much more in China than they export from China, but they're less profitable in China than elsewhere around the world. The notion that they make money off the Chinese people, that's hard really to support when we see that the positive GDP impact on China is 20 times their profits, and China does quite nicely. So China does nicely, the US companies do nicely, and basically that's why there's investment in the country. So if FDI has been such a good deal for China, why do we hear about and see examples of China potentially trying to decouple from the rest of the world? And this is, could be a long topic in and of itself, but I'll just give a couple of highlights. One is we have to remember a lot of the decoupling effort from China's standpoint is to make China less reliant on foreign technology, which presumably means potential geopolitical as well as economic weakness. China doesn't want to be cut off from major sources of technology if the US gets angry, for example. Some of the headline cases where we've seen foreign companies run into difficulties in China have much more to do with political issues than the economic contributions that the companies might make. Samsung at one point had over 15 billion US dollars invested in the Chinese mainland. But after political difficulties between South Korea and China, Samsung has largely wound down its China operations and has built up a much, much larger presence in Vietnam than it actually has in China, at least as a producer. But we also have to remember that headline GDP and GDP growth was never the primary aim of allowing foreign investment into China in the first place. It was a price to pay for WTO membership. The WTO was founded to oversee relations in trade, but because each WTO member had to approve China's entry, each WTO member was allowed to negotiate whatever terms it wanted to. Again, it had to negotiate, it couldn't unilaterally declare. And the US and many other countries actually negotiated terms about foreign investment that linked China's WTO entry to allowing foreign investment. It's not that the WTO oversees the foreign investment, it's designed to oversee trade. It's that it was part of the bargain. Foreign investment is always viewed as a way to try to improve Chinese companies and a way to develop technological strength in China. And in sectors in which Chinese companies have come up to speed in terms of capabilities, foreign firms in a number of cases are sort of being eased out or limited in scope. But we also have to remember that some of the complaints that foreign companies have about the Chinese government becoming more restrictive are also complaints that Chinese companies have as well. And in areas where China feels that it is lacking in key technologies that it needs to help develop further, actually foreign companies are still very much welcome. So again, it's not a matter ever of China opening or closing. It's a matter of China selectively opening, selectively closing to meet its perceived needs at specific points in time. And let me just say there is obviously more of interest to come on this topic. And let me stop my prepared remarks there and open it up to questions and discussion.
Thank you, Michael. I'm going to invite the audience to jump in with any questions. I think we're a small enough group that you don't have to channel them through chat. So if you would like to jump in and ask a question, please do so. I just had one comment, Michael, about the point you made about the Chinese literature versus the English literature, and the point of the Chinese literature being focused on what the impact of foreign investment is on Chinese companies and their competitiveness. That is such a profound point, I think. And when I think of India, for instance, and how it tends to view foreign investment, that filter is completely absent. The thinking that the role of foreign investment is to actually make our local companies more competitive. That aspect is completely missed. So I think it's very interesting that that is there in the Chinese literature, which of course I've never seen because I don't read Chinese. So thank you for pointing that out. But
well, in fact, when we started the project, I said we can't do this unless, you know, I had a team of PhD Chinese economists, some of whom did their doctorates under my supervision, working with me on it, and it's not even close. If you again, what we did is we took sort of top 200 papers by citations. We did the obvious things, right? And it's a good 70% of the literature or more in Chinese is focused on the impact of foreign investment on Chinese companies rather than the economy, the workforce, and economic well-being as a whole.
So my question building on that, and I can guess what the answer might be, but if that is in fact what the Chinese policymakers are most concerned about, for your study, would that not have been the more interesting metric to use as opposed to contribution to GDP and employment and things like that, which is what I think the Western audience might have tended to focus on when measuring the impact. But I can guess the answer. I don't know how you would study the impact on competitiveness, but I'll let you respond.
Well, to a certain extent, we did. To the extent we could, we did. Those were in the econometric pieces that are summarized in our book, and we've got about a 150-page document sitting on the Heinrich Foundation website that goes through, you know, the impacts on whether investment is crowded in or crowded out. We find very strong evidence that foreign investment in a sector in China will tend to result in more domestic investment rather than less investment. And what's also interesting, something that that no one else had actually looked at, was we were also able to show that the impact was particularly profound in adjacent geographies. So for example, even in industries where foreign investment into one province, let's just say Sichuan province, could have had in some ways a dampening effect on domestic investment in Sichuan province in that industry, what we found is that it would correspond to, or it would be highly correlated with substantial additional investment by local companies in the adjacent provinces. So it was quite interesting. And so we have looked at that in the econometric results. Let me pick up what's in the chat first, and then we'll go to the hands raised. In your view, should the U.S. approach a more radical view to FDI as China has done to benefit further from companies' foreign investment in the U.S.? It seems the Chinese government takes advantage to help China's companies. Well, it's the question of, is the U.S. going to be more like the U.S. or is the U.S. going to be more like China? Because the U.S., the ethos tends to be, we look at foreign investment in terms of its ability to create jobs in the U.S., to maybe invest in some infrastructure in the U.S., and that's the objective function that we look at. Could the U.S. decide to, restrict investment in some sectors to protect U.S. companies, to encourage investment under forced terms, forcing joint ventures, et cetera, in order to force technology transfer to the U.S.? The U.S. could decide to do that. It hasn't chosen to, but it could go in that direction. Now, the last administration, and again, I'm putting aside the politics of it, the last administration on trade started moving more to the China playbook of, if you want access to our market, you gotta do what we want. And it's yet to be determined. Many of those restrictions are still in place. It's yet to be determined what the current administration is going to do on that. So again, the U.S. could do that, but again, it's a matter of, are we going to stop being the U.S. because of China? And it's an interesting question, right? It's a bit of a conundrum. Carolina.
Hi,
Yes.
yeah. Thanks for the great introduction, overview. So I wrote a book about aftercare, looking after foreign investors, and I couldn't find one example from China, so my book lacks that. With such a big imprint in terms of the economy, how do Chinese governments or regions or locations or cities retain and grow established foreign investors?
Well,
is there an effort? Are there policies for that?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It varies level by level. At the and again, I have a number of how to say it. I've spent a substantial portion of the last 25 years advising foreign companies on how to get into China, how to deal with China. And part of it is actually how to play one municipal and one provincial government off against the other, because there are sizable incentives, not as big as there used to be. Used to be that foreign invested enterprises of many types got concessionary tax compared to Chinese companies, et cetera. But in favored technologies and in favored areas, special experimental zones, developmental zones, foreign enterprises can get not only corporate tax breaks, but personal tax breaks. They can get infrastructure subsidies. They can get training subsidies. Procter & Gamble, its last big distribution center in Guangzhou, basically the Guangzhou government gave them the land. So P&G had to build the facility, but they got the land for free. So all over China, local officials actively try to attract, retain foreign investment. And the ones that are sort of the most forward-looking are on very good and very friendly terms with their local foreign investors, and much more so, quite frankly, than in most places that have "quote unquote" aftercare. So, but it's not published as such, right? But again, it is literally all over China. Let's see. I'll go back to the chat. Do I see relevant changes in U.S. FDI in China as a result of the trade war? Very interesting. There has been a slowdown in the amount of investment going in, but U.S. foreign affiliate sales in China continue to increase. So in other words, while there may be less capital going in, the presence of the U.S. companies in terms of sales, employment, et cetera, continues to go up. Most of that is to serve the Chinese market. To a first approximation, companies don't actually invest overseas to produce, they invest overseas to sell. And the majority of foreign investment into China since the late 1990s has actually been in the service sector, where almost by definition, you're investing and producing on site in the foreign market. So have there been changes? The answer is yes. There are some companies in sensitive technologies that have had to pull back. There are some companies that have just become the sort of the unfortunate victims of the trade and investment wars. But for the most part, U.S. companies are keeping their head down. They may not be putting large new amounts of capital in, but they're not on average reducing what they have in China, and they're ramping up further with the Chinese economy ramping up. And remember, a lot of them now have enough earnings in China that they don't need to bring in capital from the outside. They're just reinvesting local earnings anyway. Another question is, there is a fear of losing out if you don't invest China. How do you balance that with what's happening with the tech companies and the authoritarian regime? One of the things that I tell my clients is that, let's face it, in most industries these days, if you want to be, number one, number two, or number three globally, you need a significant presence in China. China is that big an economy, right? It's the second largest economy. It's way larger than Japan, the third largest economy. So in most industries, and in some industries, China itself is 50% of the world market. So, in those industries and in a wide range of industries, if you choose not to be in China, you're choosing to forego a substantial chunk of the world market. But it's a trade-off like anything else. If you do invest in China, there are certain risks. There are foreign companies that either don't invest in R&D or limit the types of R&D investments they make in China to protect their intellectual property. That's a choice that they're making. With respect to the nature of the Chinese government, in my view, it has certainly become more control-oriented over the last 8 years than previously. And in the latest 5-year plan, certainly the overarching theme is the re-centralization of control over the economy, not just in the hands of government, but more so in the hands of the Chinese Communist Party. That is being felt by both foreign and domestic firms, right? Read about what's happened to Alibaba and Tencent and some of the big Chinese tech companies. It does have a chilling effect, and Chinese entrepreneurs. It does have an effect. Is there a chilling effect on expansion of foreign investment and foreign firms? To a certain extent, yes. Do the Chinese officials in the party and the government understand this? The answer is yes. And they're willing to pay that price in terms of foregone economic growth in return for control, which they believe gives them a better ability to oversee the economic, social, and political development of the country. What lessons, next question down in the chat, what lessons do I draw from Evergrande? And I'm not seeing any hands raised, so if I'm missing any, please flag them for me. Evergrande is an interesting example, and I've actually been on the board of directors of 3 different companies, not anymore, I'm not on the boards anymore, but 3 different mainland Chinese oriented property companies. The property sector is highly leveraged. The building materials sector is highly leveraged, and the central government has put price caps on property prices in the primary market. So you see your costs going up, your sources of funding becoming more difficult, and your price is capped. It's a recipe for somebody to have a disaster. What I think is interesting is that we have not seen what many analysts were talking about and predicting. They were predicting Evergrande going under and taking a sizable chunk of the Chinese economy with it. And that simply hasn't happened. And I don't think it shows any particular signs that it's going to happen. Does China have an overinvestment issue in the property sector? Probably yes, but it's probably more a timing issue than it is absolute value. Eventually, a lot of that stock either will be filled by people moving to new quarters or upgrading their quarters, and the old residential will be demolished and will make way for something else. Is it a problem in the market? Answer, yes. Is it an existential problem? In all likelihood, no, because the central bank and the political leadership in China has sort of put the brakes on what was much, shall we say, less responsible construction that went on 15 years ago, 10 years ago, et cetera. So it's a problem. It has to be worked through. It's going to cost in terms of, you know, the overall economy, but it's not a collapse scenario. Is the Chinese government trying to help Evergrande? Maybe yes, maybe no. The banking sector may help them bail out. They're trying to deflate what does exist as a bubble as gently as they can. They've been doing it for the last 4 or 5 years. And again, will it be a completely soft landing? Probably not, but it's not going to be a crash landing either. Let's see, with tech companies heading to the exits, is China expected to become more belligerent with Taiwan? These are related but unrelated. You know, Yahoo heading for the exit, I don't think anybody in China is going to miss them particularly. China doesn't particularly miss Google or Facebook not being on the ground there. So they don't miss the large US internet companies. And in fact, some of the restrictions that they've put on social media, gaming, et cetera, you know, you look at it and you say, well, some of this seems actually pretty reasonable given what we're learning now, for example, about the internal data that Facebook has had, et cetera. The issue with Taiwan, of course, is an issue from the mainland Chinese side of territorial integrity and a non-negotiable issue of national sovereignty. And therefore, Taiwan will never be de-escalated as an issue. The question is, will it be escalated? If it became escalated because Taiwan produces a lot of the semiconductors, well, you know, that's not that many facilities, and it wouldn't take that much to disable those facilities. It's not as if, you know, we're going to capture Taiwan and that's going to give us the world's semiconductor industry. You know, people that I know in the semiconductor industry, they don't view that as, you know, as something that's likely to happen. However, any signs of weakness on the part of a US administration towards Asia, towards Taiwan, will be viewed as a way for the mainland leadership to push one step further, one step further, one step further. Back when during the global financial crisis, when Barack Obama did his first trip to Asia and bowed down before the Chinese president and the Japanese emperor, and basically had his hat in his hand, trying, you know, for funds to help refloat the financial sector. Within 3 or 4 weeks of that visit, the dotted line map in the South China Sea became a core interest of China, elevated to the same level as Taiwan and Tibet, right? So any sign of weakness on the part of the US administration is going to lead to more overtures, and there will become a time, or there will come a time when it is likely that China, if they chose to, could act militarily in Taiwan in a way that, of course, would be unfortunate for all concerned. So Taiwan is a series of issues. Technology is only one, and it's actually, technology is not the most important one. Some small and medium-sized companies concerned about China market because of US-China tensions. Yeah, if you're a company that was hoping to export back to the US, of course, you got to look at all the tariff categories and see whether that's going to be feasible. If companies are looking to enter the China market, what I generally tell them is you got to look at the industry you're in, whether or not it's something that's strategic to China or not. if it's not strategic to China, and if you're a relatively small company, for the most part, you're just going to fly beneath the radar screen. And nobody particularly is going to bother you. They may not help you, but nobody particularly is going to bother you. If you're a very large, very visible company, then that may be different. And then if you're in a key technology that China feels it needs to have its companies dominate, well, sorry, you're not going to get much look in. On the other hand, if you're in an area like environmental technologies, where China views those technologies as critical to helping clean up the environment in China, and does not believe that Chinese companies have all the answers, there, foreign companies will have their doors wide open. Again, so it really comes down to the sector that the company is in, whether they bring something to the table that might benefit China, and whether or not they're, sort of large enough or in a space where they can sort of fly under the radar. I think we're just exceeding 7. So if, and I actually have to teach in a half hour. So if we have any final questions, either for a raised hand or something in the chat.
No raised hands, Michael.
No raised hand, and I don't see anything in the chat. In that case, I'll thank you all for attending, and I will bounce it back to Ravi.
Well, thank you, Michael. I think those are great questions, and we covered a lot of ground. Thank you very much. I just will wrap this up by reminding everyone that on December 1st, we'll have the next in our China Insight series, and featuring George Yip, who will be speaking on innovation strategies for foreign companies in China. So do show up for that. Tell your friends and colleagues. We look forward to seeing you then. Until then, good night. Again, thank you, Michael. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ravi. Thank you all.